Hello, today we're going to talk about some very important up-to-date them, and that is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. This will consist of an introduction, strategic military view of the war, and the political side of it, and a conclusion. From past to present, I'm going to try to explain the reasons of this conflict and its possible future outcomes. I won't get into the depths of the historical events, but basically, Russia invaded Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to join NATO and possibly in future install defensive missile on its territory. As I understand the Russian frustration of NATO ever expanding to their back garden, even if they promise they won't, this does not justify the use of force to promote diplomatic and political objectives. It is each country's option to choose freely their political and military alliances. Moreover, we live in a new world of cooperation and trade in which nations choose freely to cooperate and create bigger supranations. See the example of EU or trade blocs like NAFTA, Asia. The way Putin acted is a reminiscence of Soviet communist style interference in other countries' politics. This way of sorting things defies the rule of law, replacing it bluntly with the rule of fist, opening Pandora's box in international politics and transforming it in a jungle. Putin's objectives are clearly the replacement of the Ukrainian government and the installation of a puppet one. The media naively or on purpose states there is a possibility of negotiation. I clearly think the differences are too big to be fixed by negotiations. The negotiations are just a smoke grenade for each side to prove their willingness of cooperation while in fact planning to continue the war. Zelensky will not back as he knows this is gonna be his end, and he started winning some fights, so he's gonna fight to achieve at least a stalemate, while Putin thinks he can win this war. So each one has its own reasons. The fight will last longer than everyone expected. I myself thought Ukraine won't hold more than 1-2 months at the beginning of the conflict. But in the way things did evolve, we'll have two scenarios. Scenario 1. Europe and USA will continue to support indirectly Ukraine in its fight for independence with money and weapons while sanctioning Russia. In this scenario, most probably Ukraine will reach a stalemate in this war, and the scale in its length in time, possibly around 1 year, will cost Russia economically and militarily too much, and by the end of the war, its army will be crippled and its people very unhappy with the level of poverty. Russia territorially is the biggest world in European country, but also Ukraine is the second biggest country in Europe. The cost of conquering the whole of Ukraine, or even half of it, will be very big, and let's not forget, most of the best Soviet generals in World War II they were Ukrainians. Ukraine might have the lower hand, or should I say had the lower hand at the start of the conflict in comparison with Russia military, but the whole country is armed and their people are more willing to fight than the Russians. Actually, the Russians, most of them, they don't want to fight. The Ukrainian plan on the long term will be guerrilla warfare, and Russians will have to fight street by street and block by block. Unless any of the sides will use mass destruction weapons, the war not gonna have a short outcome. Talking about mass destruction weapons, I think the use of them will be avoided, as their use might trigger other countries' intervention in Ukraine, which Russia does not want. However, I cannot never underestimate Putin's madness, as recently he did use chemical weapons in support of Assad in Syria. Anyway, let's say even if the final result might find Russia on the winning side and take over the eastern half of Ukraine, that I think that is the best possible outcome for them. The cost of maintaining the occupation of even that half of a big country will be huge. Especially the resistance fighters will harass the Russian occupation. So Putin's popularity is gonna drop to record low levels and his position will be weaker and weaker. However, even worse for Russia, Ukraine might hold to a slight victory and force Putin into negotiation. Anyway, let's not draw too early to a conclusion and get to the second scenario. Europe and NATO will make Ukraine a no-fly zone for Russia. This practically is a declaration of war to Russia, as obviously Europe and NATO will provide air protection from the Russian airplanes, and in order to achieve that, European fighters Typhoon, Dassault, Gripen, F-22 and F-35 will fight with Sukhoi and MiG fighters for air supremacy in Ukrainian skies. Initially, Romania, Poland, Slovakia and Turkey voluntarily will send their armies to protect their minorities in Ukraine. Ultimately, all NATO will come in to help. I think this scenario is likely because since First and Second World War, there is a written rule in Europe and international politics: who starts the war will pay for it. The present global UN system was created to deter and condemn any future global power trying to make its rules by force. Depending if Europe will and NATO will also intervene with naval forces as well, the war might last up to 6 months. Europe has a technological advancement in the fight with Russia. For the technical supremacy is not as big as the Americans. Europe also has the second biggest military expenditure on earth after US, dozens of times bigger than Russia. European and NATO army will be a professional one, while the Russian army is a conscript-based one. As one strategy used to say, it's preferable to send to war the people that do voluntarily join and want to go to war. The conflict is going to be very destructive, especially for the Russian side. At its end, the bigger and more professional European army will win. In this case, Putin will not use any mass destruction weapons, also as Europe has a big arsenal of these as well. Anyway, no matter the fate of the battle on the ground, I think we need to draw our attention to the political and economical spectrum. So, the political and economic side of the conflict. My theory is that the Russian regime is already faltering and the cracks in the system will sooner or later sink in the ship. I think one of the most important aspects is that no one can informally isolate a country in an information war. They might fool the old people with Russia Today's TV channels, news, but they won't fool the young who use VPN to access internet and information on YouTube and other channels. From this point of view, I have no doubt that the West will win, and the moment Russia invaded Ukraine, they already lost the information war. This thing also brings me to the second aspect, that the majority of the Russian population is not hostile to Putin, but is definitely disagreeing with the invasion of a brother Slavic country that most of its history was part of Russia. Also, as we can see on the TV, Putin's position is becoming weaker as his health is deteriorating as well. As an ex-KGB officer, he might have a strong circle around him, but by the reach of winter, the Russian starving population in the big cities will turn against him. Russia in winter is profoundly dependable on food imports which most probably nobody will offer, including China, as it has a large population itself is dependable on food imports. If Putin will still be in power by winter, the economic war will show its tiger teeth in the old bear's neck. Putin knows he is trapped in this game. If he withdraws from the war, it's gonna be his end. If he continues the war, he cannot win it, because the West is gonna do everything to stop him from winning. And if the war goes over the winter, the Russian people and even its closest allies will turn against him. This is a huge dilemma that he is facing and will seal his fate. Putin is old and sick. His Ukrainian opponent, not to talk about his Russian ones, Volodmyr Zelensky, is young and vibrant. Rarely when an old bear fights with one or more young lions, the bear wins. Conclusion: whatever scenario will happen on the battlefield, Vladimir Putin's chances of remaining in power after the coming winter are very, very low. Nowadays, the Russian aggression made countries think the neutrality is not an option, as Russia might grab whatever country is in the gray area. The fact is we live in an interconnected world, and Putin informationally can't isolate Russia from the world. As technological challenge, this is practically impossible. One might consider his inner circle trustworthy, but if thousands and millions of people go into the Red Square and protest, the situation will be unimaginable, and the Soviet-style new communist dictatorship will crumble into the depth of history. And if Putin won't back down, the possibility of a Russian civil war like in First World War could also arise. My theory is that the results in the battlefield will matter less, because politically the fate of Putin's regime will seal the fate of the war as well. And anyone who will come after Putin dethronation, he will want to distance himself from Putin's political, economical and military failure in Ukraine. We'll leave that and see what happens, but in the end I'd like to give a quote of Edmund Burke: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Please like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed my video. Thanks. Slava Ukraina!